there's a lot of mixed messages that are being sent. And I think just demonizing a category of foods or ingredients is not very effective.
Hello, welcome to FDA Watch. I'm Wayne Pines. Welcome to this edition. We're the only independent, nonpartisan national forum dedicated to discussing the latest developments, trends, and issues surrounding FDA. Today we're going to focus on food issues, but as we begin, I want to start with a reminder that if you haven't subscribed to our podcast yet, you can do so at fdawatch.net. What you have to do is go to the bottom of the page and you'll be able to enter your email address and subscribe. It's free. When you subscribe, you get emails whenever a new episode appears. You get quick access to the headlines and resource links. So please do subscribe. Before we dive into food issues with our two guests, let's go to some recent headlines. First, from the Pharma desk. As we all have seen, there's been overwhelming publicity about the firing of CDC Director Susan Monarez. What it indicates is just how fragile these appointments at HHS agencies can be. She was chosen by this administration to lead CDC just a few months ago. She was a popular choice. She disagreed with COVID policies, and she was dismissed. This is important to everybody who's coming in, including the people at FDA. A few months ago, we saw Vinay Prasad resign and then get reinstated as CBER director. This is not an easy time for people to be in the government, especially in the health agencies. And people in senior positions have seen that if they disagree with leadership, their jobs are in jeopardy. The CDC episode also reinforces how central the vaccine issue is to HHS and to White House, and particularly the COVID vaccine. And that view also affects FDA because FDA continues to have to deal with COVID. Jim O'Neill, who was Kennedy's deputy, is acting CDC director. He is familiar with FDA as well. He has some background at HHS, and we'll see how that relationship evolves. So hopefully we'll see some stability at CDC and at HHS generally, and see that stability translates into FDA. From the device desk, FDA has launched a regulatory accelerator for digital health devices. This is a new initiative. Aims to offer digital health and software-based medical device developers access to several new online resources, including access to a resource index with a visual guide to currently available tools, guidance, and engagement opportunities, and access to a lot of other information related to digital health. From the foods desk, we are anticipating fairly soon that there will be a second MAHA report, Make America Healthy Again, to be issued by Secretary Kennedy. And I can't imagine that it will not address ultra-processed foods. There have been a lot of reports that it's going to address direct-to-consumer advertising. Hasn't been much publicity anticipating the ultra-processed foods issue, but I think it's almost certain that there will be something in there about ultra-processed foods. So something to watch for. The MAHA reports reflect anticipated actions and priorities by HHS, but also they set the priorities for FDA. And finally, from the cosmetics desk, FDA continues to oversee cosmetics with some regularity. The agency issued 5 warning letters to sunscreen companies that make products in mousse form. And according to the agency, sunscreens can be sold only as oils, lotions, creams, gels, butter, paste, ointment, sticks, sprays, or powders, but not as foams, mousses, or whips. So beyond calling the products potentially ineffective, FDA warned that some of these products are packaged in containers that resemble food containers. So the point of this headline is FDA continues to oversee cosmetics. I'm not talking about from a legal standpoint, but from an enforcement standpoint. And that's an important message, I think, that the cosmetics industry is going to have to be aware of. Let me introduce our guests. First up is Claudia Lewis. Claudia is co-chair of Venable's FDA Group. She counsels clients on FDA regulation, labeling, marketing of foods, over-the-counter drugs, medical devices, and other products. So welcome to FDA Watch, Claudia. Good to meet you here.
Thank you, Wayne.
And also joining us today is Ricardo Carvajal. Ricardo was the director at HPM, Hyman, Phelps, and McNamara. He previously served as Associate Chief Counsel for Foods at FDA. So welcome to FDA Watch, Ricardo.
Wayne, thanks very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
I want to start out with a priority issue for this administration, ultra-processed foods. Been a lot of publicity about it. I mentioned before that ultra-processed foods are almost certain, I believe, to be included in the next MAHA report. So, Claudia, I want to start with you with a general question. And what I'm going to urge both of you to do is to look to the future. I think everybody who's concerned about food regulation or the FDA and who's listening to this podcast knows generally the history and what Secretary Kennedy and Commissioner Dr have said about ultra-processed foods and their relationship to chronic illness. But I'm going to ask you to look to the future. What is your view as to where this is headed from a regulatory standpoint and from a public policy standpoint? Let me start with you, Claudia.
Thank you, Wayne. That's a very good question. As you said, ultra-processed foods it hasn't been advertised, but it's a popular topic. I know that my clients have asked me about it. I'm sure Ricardo have seen the same. I really think this is consistent with the agencies and the administration's push to get behind some of the food-related disease conditions or disease-related conditions that are thought to be food-related. And ultra-processed foods come to mind. They're highly processed. There needs to be a definition. There needs to be some investigation and scientific evaluation. And I think that the request for information is designed to gather that information and put some parameters around something that's a pretty ambiguous but ubiquitous term. So if I were to hazard a guess as to where this is headed, is to get some definitional terms so that we can get some regulatory guardrails in place so that we can get the American diet rebalanced and reevaluated.
Ricardo, let me ask you the same question. Looking to the future, what's your perspective on ultra-processed foods? You must have dealt with that a lot when you were at FDA.
Well, it's been such an interesting issue to track. I mean, the only thing I'll say about the history is it's one of those few issues where you can say this is a bipartisan concern, right? So former Commissioner Califf had highlighted his concerns about potential adverse health effects linked to ultra-processed foods, and now that's carried over into the new administration. I mean, as Claudia says, you have to start with the challenge of coming up with a definition for regulatory purposes or for public policy purposes. And there, we're not starting from zero, right? So the request for information that FDA put out in July noted that there's several classification schemes that are already out there. Some of them, like the NOVA system, they've been around for years, so long that now some researchers are proposing refinements and add-ons to that system. But even I think, with respect to the definitional challenge, the draft MAHA report kind of hedges its bets. It talks about exploring the possibility of a government-wide definition to support potential, in quotes, potential future research and policy activity. I think it's really hard to say where this is headed because it's a little hard to say what the depth of commitment is, especially when you start running into, financial interests, political limits. I'd say keep an eye on the MAHA report, keep an eye on the dietary guidelines because those are due out in the next few months and they could get into ultra-processed foods as well.
Yeah. The reason there are ultra-processed foods on the market is because consumers like them. They're convenient, been around obviously for as long as processing, has been in existence. Is there anything, you talked about defining what ultra processed foods? Those are, that's the way to think about it from a regulatory standpoint. From a practical standpoint, is there anything that FDA can really do about ultra processed foods that will affect chronic diseases? I'm going to start with you, Claudia, on that.
I would say this has to be, to me, a two-level approach. I think that one, getting our arms around what ultra-processed foods are and aren't, understanding the science about whether their impact on our health and the like, to me is the first step. So let's just assume, since we're talking about the future, that we've done all that work and we've done all the heavy lifting and we're not still bickering about it. I'm mindful of the fact that FDA recently issued its definition of the term healthy, and we know how long and how difficult that was, and it's still being met with some challenges. But assuming that we get all on the same page, I think that some of the limitations, reality limitations that Ricardo alluded to in terms of the industry and how they're going to respond, I also feel like the rules are one thing, but the second thing that we need to think about is how do we communicate it to the public so that it's effective. I think that when you said we like these ultra processed foods because they're delicious, they make us feel good, they're tasty, and they're very convenient. They're fast, and so really the communication to the public in terms that we need is why these should be done in moderation, how that can be accomplished. So I think it's a twofold event: getting some rules in place, but also communicating to the public more clearly. I think there's a lot of mixed messages that are being sent, and I think just demonizing a category of foods or ingredients is not very effective.
Ricardo?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question, right? Because at first blush, like this seems like such a big issue, and tackling it through the authorities provided in the Federal Food, Drug, Cosmetic Act doesn't seem very straightforward. And I mean, if you look historically, FDA has really sort of taken two approaches, right? One is focused on labeling to help people make more informed dietary choices. And the second has been encouraging reformulation through restrictions or limits. And those two are not necessarily mutually exclusive, right? So if you take the example of partially hydrogenated oils or PHOs, FDA started by requiring declaration of trans fat in the nutrition facts. That helped consumers limit their intake if they were so inclined. It also encouraged industry to kind of start reformulating because they saw that trans fat declaration is not a good thing from a marketing perspective. Eventually, FDA decided, no, not enough. We're going to revoke GRAS status. And then they denied the follow-on food additives petition, which effectively made PHOs unlawful to market in foods in the US. So that's, that's running the whole continuum from starting with a labeling initiative to finally banning that class of substances. I don't know that approach really is super well cut out for application to something as vague and abstract as ultra processed foods, because now we're moving beyond a class of substances that feels discrete to a wide array of ingredients that are used in a wide array of foods, some of which might actually be relatively healthful from a dietary perspective. So I'm inclined to think that it's the wild cards that could really move the needle on this. And by that, I mean, we've seen examples of effectively, HHS or FDA regulating through press release, right? So revocation of approvals for synthetic colors is difficult, takes time. But if you can name and shame companies and essentially force them to abandon synthetic colors, you've achieved your objective in a relatively resource efficient way. We've seen the example of USDA nutrition programs being used to encourage a move away from undesirable nutrients or substances. And I think in that draft MAHA report, there's a reference to USDA prioritizing getting whole and healthy foods, those are their words, to participants in the SNAP programs and the Head Start programs. And then maybe the third wild card, which I find super interesting, is the emergence of third-party certification schemes for non-ultra-processed foods, right? So that's the flip side of the coin, giving companies who want to take the position that they are not selling ultra-processed foods a third-party certification scheme that allows them to build a claim on that basis and, push their products to consumers that way.
So what I hear both of you saying is, if this initiative against ultra-processed foods is going to have an impact, it's not just a regulatory approach. It's got to be a multifaceted approach. It's got to involve government programs. It's got to involve, like SNAP. It's got to involve communications. It's got to involve education, and that's over a long term. Is that generally you agree with that assessment of what I just said?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're starting to see that already. We'll just see what muscle this set of initiatives has behind it.
Yeah, I do want to ask one regulatory question. And former Commissioner Kessler submitted a citizen petition saying that FDA can address ultra-processed foods by declaring certain ingredients to no longer be GRAS, generally recognized as safe. Let me start out with you, Ricardo, since you were in the General Counsel's office there. What do you think of that petition's premise? And is that a realistic approach to really getting our arms around the ultra-processed foods issue?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting in that the premise is more closely tied to the statutory authorities historically exercised by FDA. But I think, as we saw with partially hydrogenated oils, revocation of GRAS status is a complex scientific and regulatory exercise that is very resource intensive. And so you have to start to wonder about how achievable a potential revocation of GRAS status for all the different substances highlighted in Dr. Kessler's petition, is that really realistic given the current and the anticipated resource constraints? Particularly because, in shorthand, people say, oh, this is a GRAS substance, or it's not a GRAS substance. But under the terms of the Federal Food, Drug, Cosmetic Act, something is either GRAS or not based on the intended conditions of use. So you could have the same substance be GRAS for some uses and not others. And so, that's just ratcheting up the level of complexity, because FDA now, they'd have the initial burden of demonstrating a lack of consensus among scientific experts as to the safety of current uses. But that's just going to beg the follow-up question, are any uses still GRAS? And if so, which ones? And if not, are any uses eligible for food additive approval? And if so, which ones? Like we saw that with PHOs, that stretched on for years. So I'm not anticipating any quick action in response to that petition. Let's put it that way.
Claudia, I'm going to let you answer the question in a minute. But Ricardo, as in your position in the General Counsel's office, you used to have responsibility or some for answering citizen petitions. If you were still at FDA, how would you respond to Dr. Kessler's petition? That's a loaded question, I know.
Yeah, I mean, I think what we're going to see is the typical response at the 6-month time frame that says we are evaluating your petition. Right? I mean, just the complexity of the petition, all the issues it raises, the nature of the actions that it requests, there would be many, many moving parts. And as we know, there's no mandated time frame for a substantive response to a petition. Dr. Kessler's ultimate relief would be to sue FDA to compel some kind of a response from the agency. And I hate to keep harping on PHOs, but it's such a good and recent example of all of these dynamics unfolding over time. I mean, that started with a citizen petition asking FDA to revoke the GRAS status of PHOs, and eventually moved to litigation to try to compel some kind of action by the agency. Is Dr. Kessler willing to go that far? Who knows, right? But I wouldn't anticipate a lawsuit to be filed on day 181. It's more if in a few years' time it feels like there's no meaningful progress on this issue, the option of litigation is there.
Claudia, any comment on the Kessler petition?
Yes, I agree with Ricardo. Withdrawing GRAS status is a long, complicated process. I think that if we're really worried about certain ingredients or certain food categories, I think one thing that the agency could do is start with a small subset of products that they have a lot of concern around, and there's a good amount of data that shows that these products are unsafe when consumed in ordinary course as opposed to overconsumption. And so I think that, to me, and that no pun intended, I think that we need to address this in smaller bites as opposed to, this is a pretty big concept to contend with.
Both of you have clients, I'm sure, who make ultra-processed foods. Claudia, again, let me start with you. What are you telling them? What should their response be? How should they be thinking about what's going on at FDA?
So I've had several calls about this since the request for information. My main advice to clients is that they participate in the process and evaluate what they're doing currently and have a voice in this entire process. This is not something that I think will happen overnight, but you definitely want to make sure that, to the extent that there's a data call or you have evidence, that you get it in and get your voice heard. So far, there's been 96 comments submitted to FDA, and I'm hoping that some of my huge manufacturing clients will enlarge that number.
Ricardo?
Yeah, I mean, I second Claudia's comments and suggestions. And I think, again, it goes to the complexity of the issue and the definitional challenge, right? So what makes a food ultra processed? Is it the nature of the ingredients? Is it the percentage of ultra processed ingredients? Are we going to treat one type of bread differently than another if they both contained ultra processed ingredients, but one contains more whole grains than the other? I mean, there's just so many things to think about, right? So I would say participating in the process, having your voice heard, and also keeping an eye on these other developments. I mean, this is such an interesting time to be working in this field because of the advent of social media with all its good things and bad things, and the way that people communicate about their concerns and whether they think the government is being responsive or not. So there's kind of a lot to manage, even just outside of the regulatory workflow.
Right. Well, I can tell you from my own experience when I was at FDA that changing dietary habits is really, really tough. I started the original sodium education program that goes back many, many decades, and trying to get the industry to reduce sodium because the public wants foods with sodium, and trying to get people to stop wanting salt in their foods. Very, very difficult. So I think that, again, they're going to need a multidimensional approach to the ultra-processed foods issue. We'll see what the MAHA report says. We're going to take a quick break now. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back. And we're back talking with Claudia Lewis and Ricardo Carvajal. Claudia, I want to start out with you and deal with the nutrition label. The label has undergone many changes over the decades. Again, I was involved in that. The original nutrition label was designed when I was head of communications at FDA, and my office literally designed the first nutrition label. Where does food labeling, where does nutrition labeling fit into this general initiative by HHS and FDA to deal with ultra-processed foods, to deal with chronic diseases, to deal with the food supply more generally?
Well, food labeling always plays a significant role, and I think it's playing a significant role here as well. When you probably know that earlier this year, the FDA issued a proposed rule to require front of pack labeling for most packaged foods. Uh, and that initiative is to, help consumers. And some of the things that I've been concerned about and talked about today is to help consumers have a better understanding of, you know, what the nutrition information means and to identify at a glance, healthier options or healthy choice options. And so it's the front of pack is designed or will be designed to complement the nutrition facts labeling, and they are planning to use a medium, low, high in terms of the fat, sodium, and added sugar content, so consumers can easily identify those foods.
Is there going to be support for that within the industry? Where does the industry stand on front of package labeling?
For me, my clients is a mixed bag. Real estate on the labels is always a big debate when you're talking about the industry, and how meaningful this type of information will be to consumers is also being debated. Largely, most of my large clients are in favor of this type of information because it is a simplification of information, and it will be easy to define and understand. And so, but some of my clients who are in the snack food industry are not as happy about these types of things. And I think that, Ricardo, you said it best. Like, well, if you're in the high category, does that necessarily mean you're not healthy? You might not be healthy in certain categories, but it's perfectly fine in others.
Yeah, Ricardo, what about food labeling? What about nutrition labeling?
Yeah, I mean, certainly I've had questions from clients that are really anxious about what any final rule might look like. Although, I think one possibility is that we'll see a reproposal, right? Depending on the nature of the issues raised in the comments and how difficult it is to move forward with anything without further input, maybe we see a reproposal, or maybe we see a straight to final rule, or maybe we don't see anything at all. So that, the draft MAHA report sort of characterized it as, potential front of pack nutrition information final rule. But in any case, there certainly could be changes. As Claudia says, you have a proposed rule that calls out for a label that kind of focuses attention on added sugars, saturated fat, sodium. But we've seen that we have a Secretary of Health and Human Services who views lard as being more healthy than seed oils. So, there's going to be some interesting tension to reconcile internally at the agency. The only other thing I think is worth keeping an eye on is the draft MAHA report indicates an interest on the part of HHS and the Federal Trade Commission, which regulates food advertising, in developing industry guidelines to limit direct marketing of, and I'm going to use their words, certain unhealthy foods to children. So the idea being that, direct marketing to children, particularly when you're talking about unhealthy foods, is essentially part of the problem, right? It's enticing children to consume foods that are not good for them and setting them up for this lifetime of potentially increased risk to development of nutrition-related diseases. So, one of the things to keep an eye on if that initiative moves forward is which foods are going to be deemed unhealthy. Is it going to be ultra-processed foods or foods that have, significant quantity of ultra-processed ingredients? We'll see.
I want to shift gears a bit. There seem to be a lot of food recalls lately. I don't know whether I'm just noticing more or whether there actually are more. I haven't looked at the statistics. Has there been an increase in food recalls lately? Ricardo, let's start. Is that real, or is that just a perception, at least on my part?
No, I feel like I saw something cross my desk that suggested that there had been an increase, but you know, data like that, until you dive into the details, it's very hard to ascribe any meaning to it, I think.
And I always think that there's more recalls during the summer for some reason. I feel like the summer season, for whatever reason, I don't know whether it's because it's hot or what's happening, but I always feel like there's a lot more going on in the summer because we have been handling not more than usual, but I do feel like there's been sort of a pooling of the recalls, Wayne, in over a specific period.
Right. Again, I want to shift gears, talk about food inspections. As we know, most food inspections are done by the states or coordinated with the states. There's a squeeze on FDA money and its appropriated funds. States have more limited money to do food inspections. What are your concerns about food inspections as we move forward? What are the implications? Claudia, let me ask you to address that first with regard to inspections.
At the beginning of this administration, there was just a regulatory freeze and a regulatory hold, and inspections were among them, at least with FDA. I have seen the inspections move forward with an increased cadence, not where we were prior to the administration change, but a significant uptick. And when you're talking to the inspector or doing the helping clients through an inspection, some people have just recently been trained or been moved around, shift around with it from one segment of the agency to the other, and most cite that this is resource related. And so obviously when there's a shrinking budget and also just shrinking personnel resources, there's always the question about what the scrutiny will be, what it will look like, what type of regulatory oversight is still in place. And I think that from a consumer perception, that could also trickle down into, safety questions in terms of the food supply. So I saw a drop off, but now I'm seeing a pickup. So we're helping clients with inspections despite some of the budgetary limitations.
Ricardo?
I mean, there was a fair amount of work done in previous administrations with trying to integrate our disparate food safety systems, because we have a federal food safety system and then we have all the states also exercising oversight of food safety. So there's a fair amount of work done to try to harmonize, integrate. I've seen different numbers for the percentage of food inspections that are done by states. Whatever the precise number, a lot of those are being done under contract with FDA. So, there's some opportunity for harmonization and standardizing there. At the end of the day, whether FDA is doing the inspections directly or states are doing them under contract with FDA, it's all contingent on congressional funding, right? And I've seen some indication that, for example, the National Association of State Departments of Agriculture has been asking Congress to direct a certain minimum level of funding toward contract inspections for the upcoming fiscal year. So there is pressure and interest in securing funding for inspections. And interestingly enough, another one of these rare bipartisan issues, but there have been discussions dating back to the prior administration of the possibility of having states do 100% of routine inspections. The idea there is, let's reduce duplication, let's increase efficiency. Hard to say if that idea is going to gain any traction. But it's clear that some level of federal funding is going to be critical to ensure continuing adequate food safety oversight.
Final topic I want to cover is AI. Is either of you working with clients, with your food clients, on using more AI capabilities in terms of anything? How is the food industry adapting to the advent of AI? Claudia, again, I'm going to start with you on that one.
Yes, my clients are using AI, and it's been very interesting to sort of watch the evolution from, preparing, simple um, ingredient rationales to asking for full scientific dossiers, or from anywhere from safety to efficacy. Um, Obviously, it's still a work in progress. I don't recommend it. Our clients certainly don't lean into this in that way, that, you use AI to come up with your um, formulation rationale or support. But I have been surprised by that it's not a bad first start, and it certainly gives ideas and directions of, in both regards, in areas where things are going correct and areas where AI is getting it wrong, and it's allowed us to avoid a couple of mistakes as well. So clients are using it. It's just sort of what I consider to be, let's Google it first and see what we come up with. And um, AI is sort of the first tool, is becoming our Google barometer in certain instances.
Ricardo?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the problems with discussions about AI is, at least personally, I'm not ever sure that I know what people are talking about, or if they're talking about the same thing, right? Because we hear about all these different technologies being lumped into this umbrella. And I've been trying to figure out, okay, how is FDA using this in its foods program? And I haven't seen a lot of transparency on that front. I mean, we have some charming acronyms, right? So there's WILE, WILEE, which stands for the Warp Intelligent Learning Engine, presumably named after Dr. Harvey Wiley. But all you have is sort of a bland description of this system as being helpful in post-market monitoring of the food supply. So exactly what is it doing? How well is it working? Who knows? And then we saw the much more high-profile rollout of ELSA. I don't know if ELSA has a namesake, but Commissioner McCarry described it as generative AI, and it's supposed to help FDA staff work more efficiently and shorten the time needed for scientific evaluations and help summarize adverse events and perform faster label comparisons and a bunch of things, which, to the extent that it's being supervised by adults, could be useful. What I have seen cross my own desk, sometimes I have clients who will send me an inquiry and they start with a chat GPT analysis and conclusion, and then I spend a fair amount of time deconstructing it, figure out why it went wrong, because there's still a lot of hallucination with these systems, and then explaining to the client what the correct answer is. And I don't mind doing it. It's good, honest work, but it shows you that these systems still have a lot of limitations. And so there again, you wonder, if there isn't adequate supervision, you could end up with some pretty bad decision making, or from the FDA perspective, decisions that lack an adequate scientific and legal basis, and so then are vulnerable to challenge.
Yeah, I think that we're going to see the use of AI very aggressively in the pharmaceutical and medical device areas in terms of evaluating large clinical trials, and we'll see how it works. Certainly, Dr. McCarry has said many, many times how committed he is to using AI across the board at FDA, and certainly that's going to apply in the food area. And companies are going to have to adapt to that, and then use AI themselves, because AI, from a technology standpoint, is obviously the future. I'm going to turn briefly to our resource link segment. At the end of all of our podcasts, we provide some links to articles or papers that might be of interest. You can access all of this on fdawatch.net, which is our website. First, with regard to pharmaceuticals, I mentioned before vaccines, a lot of confusion about vaccines. There's an article in Axios that breaks it all down in terms of explaining what's going on. I would urge anybody who is confused to read that article and get a sense of what's going on with regard to federal vaccine policy. It's unclear to a lot of people whether they should or should not get vaccinated and which vaccines are still appropriate just across the board, but specifically with regard to COVID. In the medical devices area, regulators from FDA, Health Canada, and the UK have issued 5 guiding principles on how machine learning-enabled medical devices can safely adapt and improve through certain predetermined change control plans. That allows machine learning-enabled medical device developers to specify and manage planned software or algorithm modifications through what FDA calls clearly defined, risk-based controls grounded in overall good machine learning practice. This new guidance is on FDA's website and is accessible through our resource link. On the food side, we put on our resource link another FDA link, which takes you to the agency's webpage that is tracking which food companies have made pledges to remove so-called petroleum-based food dyes from their products. The page includes a tracking spreadsheet, lists the companies, the affected products, the brands, the planned changes, the status of those changes, so you can check that out to see which companies and which brands are moving ahead with what was some sort of a commitment to FDA to ban certain food dyes. And finally, on the cosmetics page, the British Beauty Council joined a coalition of UK consumer groups and public safety organizations to push for tougher regulation of digital marketplaces. That follows the UK's introduction of the Product Regulation and Metrology Act earlier this year. It does not directly affect the US, but it's important to share what's happening internationally. So you can check out our resource link to the British Beauty Council's letter to the UK Minister for Employment Right, Competition and Markets. Again, all of these links are available at fdawatch.net. On that note, I want to thank Claudia and Ricardo for being such excellent guests. It's clear that in the food area, there is a lot going on and a lot more that will be going on, and something that Secretary Kennedy and Commissioner McCarry have expressed a personal interest in. This is the first time that you've had a team like that at the top of HHS and FDA that has had such an interest in foods. And we'll see whether that's leads to better regulation. We'll see what happens. But certainly food issues have the attention of the leadership of HHS and FDA. Also want to thank our podcast creator and executive producer, Michael Levin Epstein, our assistant producer, Sam Hoffmeister. I want to remind everybody, as we say at the end of all of our podcasts, if you want to become a guest, if you want to be a marketing sponsor or just comment on the show, you can reach us at info@fdawatch.net. That's info@fdawatch.net. And if you're so inclined to give us a rating on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or whatever you get your podcast, it really does make a difference. And again, I'm going to remind you to subscribe, fdawatch.net. Go to the bottom of the page, put in your email address, and you'll get notifications every time we have a podcast. And as we say at the end of every episode of FDA Watch, if you really want to watch what FDA is doing, listen to FDA Watch.